make a comment that this is an open public meeting. And if you do have any comments, questions, send your comments to Lori Perry. And through the chat. All right, Joe.
Okay, thank you, Commissioner. We are on the downhill slope of today's presentation. We got about 10 slides left, and some of our team members need to be out of here by 4 o'clock, so we're going to try and stick to a schedule here. Okay, so let's take a look at the economic outlook and some of the things that we have to consider as we develop the 2024 budget. Obviously, property taxes. We have gotten preliminary numbers from the county, and those numbers show a 7 to 9% reduction in assessed values in our jurisdiction. That equates to about $1 billion off of the property values. So numbers will continue to come in from the county between now and November. So hopefully the picture gets a little bit better for us, but there is a current reduction. So the projections that we had hoped to receive in terms of the lid lift revenue aren't as rosy as we thought. There certainly is more revenue than if we had run the lid lift, but it's not going to provide as much of a cushion. So it is something that we're going to have to be mindful of as we go into the budget and as we go into 2024. If you could actually advance one slide and then, okay, so the King County issues economic forecast every quarter or so, and the March 2020 forecast showed a projected negative 3.98% reduction in AVs in our area, and then a flat line in 2025. The August projection on the right has been updated to show a negative 6.22% reduction, and then things actually getting back to about a 3% increase in 25. You know, this is just a few months difference, March to August. And you can see those are completely two different pictures. Now, again, that's a county-wide assessment. So when you look at Federal Way, Des Moines, unincorporated King County, we're seeing right now 7 to 9% reduction. But the point here is they were originally thinking it wasn't going to be as bad and then it's going to flatline. Now it's going to be a little worse, but then we should recover. We don't know, and they don't know. So we learn as we go along, but it's something that we have to be paying attention to, and will most definitely impact our budget process and what we do for the planning in 2024. Can you go back now? Okay. The point today is not to get into any one particular topic. It's to just highlight some of the factors that will need to be considered during the process. The City of Federal Way plans to implement a tax increment financing zone, otherwise known as the TIF. This will, if it passes, this will divert property tax revenue that the fire district would have collected to the city's coffers so that they can fund economic development in a portion of Federal Way. We are currently working with the city. We are pleased that the city council is aware of our concerns. And we've had positive meetings with the city manager and the city finance director. And they are open and working with us on a mitigation plan. But it is something that needs to be considered because there will very likely be a diversion of tax revenue for this foreseeable future. We have the threat of a recession. I don't like that because I don't think anybody really knows, but we can't take it off the table. And all signs seem to point to one will happen. Nobody knows when and to what extent it will look like, but it is something we need to be planning. And then we have our current funding M&O levy that expires at the end of 24. So we have a question from one of our members on where are we getting the projection. We get preliminary worksheets from King County every week through November until the budget process, or I'm sorry, until the assessments are complete at the county level, in which they send us a final levy worksheet. And we received our first worksheet last week, and that's what showed the reduction in AVs. That was a question that came in. Okay. Can you advance? Yes.
Before we go on the TIF, that's for a deferred.
That is correct. The city of Federal Way was originally looking at a 20-year timeframe. I believe they've adjusted it to 25 now. I also believe that they are scaling back a little bit. You know, this is their first attempt to do it, and they know that they need to be successful. Otherwise, they probably won't have an opportunity to do it ever again. So they are scaling back on what the impacts might look like. But nonetheless, everything points to them moving forward.
Joe, what's the latest number? The loss for the fire district would be
25 million over 29 million over 25 years.
starting off low and then
Starting off low and then ratcheting it up. And the fire chief and I met, we've met several times, but one of the concerns, obviously money is a concern, but the concern is that we can't react to the growth. We have to plan for it. And so if any mitigation is in place, we need to have that in place now and be putting things in place, whether it's efforts to build a new fire station or more units, whatever that looks like. We have to start that process now, because by the time the development is in place, we're going to be behind the 8.
I guess is the impact of the tax exempt.
Keep going. Can you go forward? Okay, so you beat me to it. We have our ongoing labor contracts that need to be negotiated. We have tax exemptions, so that's what Commissioner Thompson is referring to. That limit funding for the fire district. Those are adopted at different levels, state, city levels, but I don't have the numbers in front of me, but there's certainly a financial impact to exemptions that are being made. And Commissioner Thompson has done a significant amount of work at the King County Commissioner level on this subject. It's something that we will be considering as we move forward in the budget process. Did you have anything you wanted to add? Okay. We have neighboring levies and taxpayer fatigue. So what competing ballot measures might be in place when we go out to do whatever we need to do? We have the EMS levy. The school might run a bond or issue. What out there competes for funds? And then we have the taxpayer fatigue, which is real. And again, the calls, the inquiries this go around highlights that it seems like every time we turn around, and we are all taxpayers ourselves, you know, seems like somebody's got their hand out needing more and more and more. So we need to be mindful of that. We also have grants and alternate funding. So we've actually been successful the last couple of years in securing grants again. We got the VOTE grant, which was more than $750,000. We had the DEI Workforce Development Grant, and we had a compressor grant. So all in all, the last several years, we've gotten about 1.2, give or take, in grants. Ideally, we would have somebody on staff going out and seeking it, but We do have our legislative advocate for now. Okay. We're gonna switch gears over to district funds, and I apologize, it's broken up on the screen, but currently we have our general fund, which is our primary fund for all revenues and expenditures. We have our capital fund used for the timely replacement of capital equipment and apparatus, facilities improvements. We have our contingency fund, which is what was referred to formerly as the rainy day fund, available for emergencies and unforeseen circumstances. We have our medical restricted fund for our self-insurance medical plan. And then we have our left one fund for disabilities. Keep going back. Okay. This is kind of a picture of what our funds look like. Now, if you could go forward. This was actually part of this. The next several slides is what we presented back in that 2021 retreat. It's interesting to see the evolution of reserving in this organization. Back in 2009, you see that the language that pertained to our funds available as of January 2010 will allow South King Fire and Rescue to meet its first quarter obligations as property tax revenue for the year typically credited to our account. So the funds at the time were viewed as meeting our financial obligations in the moment. Then in 2010, the language in the budget was changed to establishing a minimum goal of $8 million in combined general fund and reserve accounts. So we see now this, bring it all together, and now we've got 8 million, and that should be sufficient. Back at that time, our expenses were under 2 million a month. So, that was probably a 4-month cash flow, if you will. But again, that's not the general fund, that's a combined. Now, if you could go forward. So in 2018, the state auditor required us to view our funds differently. And so we had to start talking about unreserved and reserve accounts. And so there was a slight modification to the language that had been in place for, 8 years or so, whatever that was, to account for the change of names. But then in 2021, this is when we had assumed the budget responsibility. We added language to the budget that the Board of Fire Commissioners may be asked to consider restructuring fund balance minimums and allocations pending the outcome of an analysis. So we planted the seed with the board that we need to start looking at this a little bit differently. And in the 2023 budget, we had replaced the language you saw a minute ago with actually a goal of maintaining the following minimum thresholds. And we introduced reserving at percents of budget. So at that point in time, we recommended the minimum general fund balance be 10%. The contingency cash fund at 8%, the capital fund at 15%. So that was our first sort of effort to see reserves and see amounts a little bit differently than they had been viewed in the past. We want to continue to evolve our thought process here. And one of the entities and organizations that Commissioner Berger tipped us off to was the Government Finance Officers Association when he came on board. And we are now members, and Kelsey and I both receive a lot of good information from this group. And they recently had a pretty robust publication on reserves. And it happened to coincide with our, thinking in terms of coming back to the board and what should we be doing and how are we going to view the economic uncertainty and how are we going to be prepared. And so we want to start to plant the seed that we need to look at reserves a little bit differently. Um, and not so much as savings, because that's, in my opinion, the way that it's been viewed before is, well, we have this account over here and we'll draw from it if we need to, but we just kind of let it sit, we let it do its thing. Well, you can see in the last several years, we've changed that approach and we're actually funding it. But we also want to look at it as more of an insurance to truly guard against risk of revenue instability or catastrophic events. So the old rainy day fund, the contingency fund, in our opinion, should be available cash for unforeseen circumstances. We have a natural disaster and we need to the board authorizes the district to dip into that fund to buy things of significance that we need to support the disaster. But not dip into a contingency reserve fund to make ends meet if we have a revenue reduction. And in our research, many government entities during the last recession cut back. And GFOA actually suggested that was the wrong thing to do. Had they had adequate insurance reserves to tap into, they could have sustained, kept firefighters on the streets, kept people employed, and then mitigated downstream. But that's not what we did. We didn't dip into a reserve fund and keep afloat. We had incentivized retirements. We had reductions through voluntary layoffs, blah, 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 blah. And we got smaller and smaller and smaller. And we are still recovering from that. So if we can get to the point where the board supports the creation of a true insurance fund, if we do in fact hit a recession, hopefully we can use that to stay afloat under the circumstances. And Chief Van Valkenburg mentioned that Bothell, city of Bothell, during the last recession had apparently had an adequate fund for this purpose.
Well, between funding and spending cuts, the Public Works, Fire, and PD didn't lay people off.
Yeah. It's not that you don't scale back your budget, right? But to the extent that we had, and we're still recovering from it, if we can avoid that, all the better. Okay. Okay. So Kelsey has put in a lot of work. We're not going to go through obviously today, but we have a policy that we will vet through the Finance and Audit Committee and our legal team that actually takes the evolution of language in the budget adoption process for reserves and actually puts it into a governance policy. And obviously we will state the policy purpose, but the policy shall set reserve allocations. We've learned, if you look at the last, where we put up a percentage, 10%, we've learned that the best practice is to establish a minimum and a maximum range. What the acceptable use of those reserve funds should be, what's the authority to use them, and then what's the replenishment plan. So if you do have to dip into it, how are you going to make sure it's there if you need to do it again? This will all be in process this month, and the goal of budget adoption, having the board support a policy on reserves. You have anything you want to add?
There's a difference between fund balance and reserve. GFOA and the auditor's office talk about that. And fund balance is ultimately to be there because of the cycle of our property. While a reserve is more of an insurance. So those will all be.
Any questions?
The reserve fund would take the place of contingency.
So we're still working through it, but what we may do, given our current position, is we may recommend some movements of funds to create an insurance fund. And then obviously establishing those ranges
Does the Government Finance Officers Association suggest ranges?
Yes.
And we'll see that
Yes.
today, next time?
Not today. You won't see it today. So we will have budget meetings in October and November. And as this process moves along, the board will be involved. We just didn't want, for the sake of time today, we didn't want to get into pulling a policy up and providing it's more of a workshop or a finance and audit committee discussion. But we will seek to get it in place at or before budget adoption process.
Can we go back to the previous slide? I want to just talk about, mention unforeseen circumstances.
Yes.
Green rectangle on the lower left there. Catastrophic events. I did reading the article in Seattle Times a couple of weeks ago, maybe some colleagues, somebody read. I don't want to sound doom and gloom, but this is reality. We live in a major earthquake zone.
Yeah.
And pretty scary to think that a 6.7 quake on the Seattle fault could kill as many people. Projected $50 billion in economic loss. But they actually have analyzed based on looking at trees that are submerged, that were damaged in major years ago. Still exist looking at the growth rates that are when they stopped. And they're talking about a 7.8 quake potential that this has, that these faults. I'm not talking about the Cascadia continental shift. I'm talking about local faults here. Probably through Seattle, what you call them. 7.8. A 7.8 on the Richter scale is 40 times more powerful than 6.6.
Yeah.
Geometric.
Yeah.
And so how does that relate to this? I guess my point is not, it's not beyond scale of expectation that if we take that large hit, we wouldn't get any tax revenue if it hit during the period of time that the bills went, were due. There would be way too many people killed and injured and affected physically to be able to deal with sending in their tax bill. So what would the district do? We would still have an obligation that would be even greater than a typical public agency to protect people.
Absolutely.
We have to keep firefighters on the street
Absolutely.
for weeks and months at a time with no revenue coming in. So the notion of having, I don't remember what the number was, Joe. 8%, something like that.
Yeah.
When you have a payroll plus other expenses of over $3 million a month, it doesn't take very long to go through that.
Approaching yeah.
I don't think it's unrealistic, especially a public safety agency like this district, is to have that kind of money on hand with the expectation that if and when something like that were to happen, we would have to use that money as the insurance fund to continue operations.
Absolutely.
Public isn't going to forgive us for the obligation to continue to serve medical emergency fires, especially under those just because we don't have tax revenue. That's my.
And it's spot on question.
I was just gonna go back to the quote that Joe said, we don't know what we don't know. We don't know when that would happen. It's a possibility. So the reserves as an insurance plan, a great idea to look and mitigate risk.
Absolutely. And to your point, I think it's actually 3.38 and growing. So we're going to be close to 4 million plus in monthly expenditures. So when you look at those millions of dollars, it goes pretty quickly because we've grown from a budget perspective. So we have to get caught up. But there's a balance, right? We can't just pluck X amount of money and set it aside and say, you know what, we're not going to staff or we're not going to, increase this or that. We have to balance it, but we are playing catch up too. Okay, Don, we got about 10 minutes. Okay. Oh, it happens to be the last slide. Look at that. What does the quote say? It's hard for the commissioners to see it, but it says, if you fail to plan, you plan to fail. There's a lot of different planning quotes, but that's the point. And we are in the business of being prepared, but we're also in the business of reacting. We react every single day when the call comes in. And so we need to get back to balancing the reacting and the preparing. And so, and I think that we've made progress in that arena. So, what do we have on the docket? We have Station 62 and Station 68. We ran out of bond funds. And so if that earthquake hits that you just spoke of, this building, it looks great in right now with fresh paint and some tech, but this building and our headquarters station are buildings that could fall. So we need to get those retrofitted soon, but those are multi-million-dollar expenditures. And again, the desire, the hope is to sell the property and use those proceeds. We need to buy a ladder truck. And we've talked about increasing call volume and getting another station. But it's one thing to build a fire station. It's another thing to staff it. And so how can we achieve all of those goals? DC Barrett made the comment, the benefit charge. And we think that that is the solution is, you know, but that doesn't necessarily fund building a fire station. So how can we fund building a fire station and then use something like the benefit charge to increase our staffing? And how do we grow to support the housing and economic development plans in Federal Way and Des Moines? All of this growth is driven by the cities and transit. So we have to be able to continue to be looking ahead and planning. And everybody knows we have our strategic bridge plan. And the primary focus of that plan, there's a lot of good coming out of that plan, communication, you know, performance evaluations, all of the things that were addressed in the organizational health assessment. But the most important out of all of that is the funding, because that is going to be our ability to continue to grow. And if we get that funding in place, then we can have a true strategic plan. Any questions for us? So the point of today,
When we get beyond the budgeting for this year, a session on the benefit charge of understanding what the bits and pieces are of that and what you've learned from Renton. Just kind of what that process is going to look like.
absolutely.
Go there.
So we have, I think there's a meeting this month with Seth, right, at the October meeting. Seth will be coming in to discuss, and I think there's going to be report outs by the stakeholders, and we will include that in the discussion, Commissioner. I wanted to just comment that the intent of this meeting was to plant the seed for the challenges that we're facing, some that we're not even aware of. But as we develop this budget, it's far greater than just people and things. There are a lot of outside forces at play here, a lot of uncertainty going into next year. We need to be mindful about all of that.
When will you be coming to us with a recommendation funding? I mean,
I believe November or December.
the old one,
The benefit charge, yes. The timeline in the strategic bridge plan is for us to come to you in the fourth quarter of this year.
So to Bill's point, Bill Fuller's point, we will have some kind of a workshop. Board will have a workshop.
Oh, yes.
To understand the nuts and bolts.
Yes.
How it would be structured before we're asked to consider putting it on the ballot.
Any questions, comments? It's a lot of information. And now we start the budget process. No, we've started, but what I mean is the actual, yeah, we're getting into the nuts and bolts of the budget here, so.
I guess one of the things is that we're a handful of fire districts in
That's correct.
Where the first time we did it, we were one of the few districts out.
Yeah.
Things have changed 180 degrees
Yes.
and we're kind of ahead of the
About when was that?
29,
20.
2009 or
Was it-
10.
Was it the bottom of the Great Recession? Was it just?
You know what? It might have been 11 or 12. I don't recall.
But it was after the beginning of the Great Recession.
Yeah.
I think the bigger challenge with housing is what you said, there weren't very many different. If you look now, the other three big departments are the zone of Boston.
Yeah.
We're the one last big department that has. Of course, I think that was the biggest problem. And just like you guys are asking now, explain to us, help us understand what this looks like, what all the pieces are. So you're involved in the organization, and you have more knowledge than the average person. So now trying to explain that to the average Joe, who, and when they hear it, the way some departments have sold it is, we're gonna change this funding model, and you, the individual homeowner, you're actually gonna pay less, but we're gonna get more money. And they're like, how does that magic work? You know, so yeah, it's really the biggest challenge is educating the public on what it is and what it's.
Well, because of what you just said, there's also an education of the business property. community.
Yes.
And the business property community is different than the business owner community generally. So we have to get to the business property owners. They're not necessarily represented by the Chamber of Commerce.
And one thing that we know, and we've already talked, you guys identified the lack of tax dollars we get from that would not be exempt from this. So that's one of the topics we're gonna take head on.
And it's not a vote of property owners, it's still, however, a vote of voters.
Right.
But we'll still have to educate everybody
Yes,
because
It's a big challenge.
everybody's affected.
it's not as straightforward as developing for a topic. It's pretty easy to explain.
And one of the advantages, because there's so many more using the benefit charge, we can always ask your brother or your sister, folks who may live in Woodinville, the impact when they went to the service band. Oh, it went down. Okay. And now they got a point of reference that makes sense, whatever we said,
Biggest challenge is every community,
right?
if you have a big industrial base.
You don't have. Oh,
Okay. Thank you for your time today.
You,
Thank you.
All right.
very good.
Think you can end the meeting.
Hey, we are adjourned. Thank you.